you're wrapped in layers of stiff petticoats. Corset tightens so much it feels like you can't breathe. And over all of that, a hoop skirt wide enough to block a doorway. You're attending a royal ball, chandeliers glowing, violins playing. It's elegant, it's refined, it's beautiful. And then nature calls. You pause for a moment. How on earth do you lift 20 pounds of fabric? Where do you even go? And more importantly, how did women in the Victorian era manage something as ordinary, yet as unavoidable as menstruation, while buried in all those layers? Welcome to the Victorian age, a world of breathtaking gowns, strict etiquette, and hygiene practices that will make your jaw drop. Victorian fashion, made iconic by Queen Victoria herself, symbolized elegance, wealth, and femininity. Women glided across ballrooms in enormous crinolines, the skirts supported by cages of steel and whalebone. To the eye, it looked majestic. But hidden beneath that grandeur was a daily struggle. Society demanded that women remain graceful, demure, and perfect. Yet beneath the silks and lace, they were sweating, struggling, and facing hygiene challenges that most history books politely ignore. Let's set the scene. Early Victorian Britain. Running water and flushing toilets, rare luxuries, underground sewers, barely imagined. The reality was much messier. When nature called, people went wherever they could, behind a tree. In a corner of the house, the phrase "don't have a pot to piss in" wasn't a joke, it was brutally literal. Families without a chamber pot had no choice but to step outside, and those who did own a pot, well, things didn't exactly stay contained. The chamber pot, sometimes politely called a jerry in British slang, was a simple bowl. It's usually ceramic or metal, used for collecting human waste. It often came with a lid. It's not for courtesy, but as a warning. Full. Do not approach. In poorer homes, the pot sat in the corner of the room, used by everyone in the family. Privacy? Forget it. Children, parents, even grandparents, everyone shared the same space, and sometimes the same pot. In wealthier households, chamber pots were hidden inside fancy furniture, cabinets, nightstands, even disguised chairs. Servants scurried through the halls, checking and emptying them multiple times a day. But let's not pretend it was glamorous. The contents usually ended up where? Right out the window. Imagine walking through London in the mid-1800s. You step outside in polished shoes, perhaps with an umbrella over your head. But the real danger isn't rain, it's what might fall from the upstairs window, with a cry of gardes low. French for watch out for the water. Someone would tip a pot and send its contents splattering down onto the cobblestones below. Yes, that polite warning meant you had just seconds to dodge falling urine and feces. Streets overflowed. The stench was unbearable. Raised stepping stones were sometimes installed so pedestrians could leap over running waste. And in summer, the smell was enough to make travelers faint. Here's a surprising twist. Waste wasn't always wasted. During the Napoleonic Wars and even the English Civil War, government collectors went door to door gathering urine. Why? Because urine was refined into saltpeter, a key ingredient in gunpowder. Yes, your pee could literally end up on the battlefield. Now let's turn back to women's fashion. With layers of petticoats, crinolines, overskirts, and bodices, underwear wasn't considered essential. For much of the early Victorian era, most women didn't wear knickers at all, but as skirts. Grew larger in gusts of wind, sometimes flipped them in public. Society blushed and whispered, perhaps it's time for drawers. But Victorian drawers were not what you think. They were crotchless too, legs connected at the waist, open down the middle. Why? Because lifting 20 pounds of fabric every time you needed the pot simply wasn't practical. This open design allowed women to gracefully lower themselves over a chamber pot, without undressing, without revealing everything, and without missing a step at the ball. At high society events, retiring rooms were set aside for this exact purpose. Inside, multiple pots waited. Maids assisted, lifting skirts and discreetly sliding the pot into place. With enough practice, the entire maneuver could happen unnoticed. Quick wipe, a rearrangement of skirts. The lady would return to the ballroom as if nothing had happened. For poorer women, it was far rougher. Pot on the floor, skirts up, squat, wipe with whatever was available, or rags, newspaper, or even leaves. And that brings us to the question no one dares to ask, but everyone wonders. How did Victorians wipe? Brace yourself. One popular tool was the dried corn cob. Yes, corn on the cob, stripped of kernels, rotated like a crude brush. Primitive, but effective enough. Another option. The communal sea sponge on a stick. After use, it was dipped into a bucket of salt water or vinegar, shared among family members. Hygiene. Highly questionable. Other materials included straw, leaves, even seashells. Eventually, paper became more common, but newspapers and catalogs doubled as bathroom supplies. Toilet paper, as we know it, only appeared in the late 1800s, and it took decades before soft rolls became normal. And now to the most delicate question. How did women manage menstruation under all that fabric? First, it's worth noting that Victorian women had fewer periods than modern women. Menopause often came earlier. Malnutrition and physical labor meant many had irregular cycles. Periods still happened, and when they did, the solutions were far from convenient. There were no pads, no tampons, no disposables. Instead, women relied on washable rag pads or improvised absorbent materials. Moss, wool, even grass. These were tied in place with a cloth contraption called a T-bandage, a strip of fabric running between the legs, secured at the waist like a primitive bikini bottom. The pads had to be changed often, sometimes a dozen or more times a day, washed, dried, and reused. It was exhausting, messy, and kept secret under layers of fabric. On lighter days, some women simply wore extra petticoats and hoped for the best. Later, when crotchless drawers became common, they offered almost no protection. They were designed for convenience, not hygiene. Yet through it all, women were expected to remain poised, graceful, and silent. Pain, odor, stainsel had to be managed without anyone noticing. And now to the most delicate question. How did women manage menstruation under all that fabric? First, it's worth noting that Victorian women had fewer periods than modern women. Menopause often came earlier. Malnutrition and physical labor meant many had irregular cycles. Periods still happened, and when they did, the solutions were far from convenient. There were no pads, no tampons, no disposables. Instead, women relied on washable rag pads or improvised absorbent materials. Moss, wool, even grass. These were tied in place with a cloth contraption called a T-bandage, a strip of fabric running between the legs, secured at the waist like a primitive bikini bottom. The pads had to be changed often, sometimes a dozen or more times a day, washed, dried, and reused. It was exhausting, messy, and kept secret under layers of fabric. On lighter days, some women simply wore extra petticoats and hoped for the best. Later, when crotchless drawers became common, they offered almost no protection. They were designed for convenience, not hygiene. Yet through it all, women were expected to remain poised, graceful, and silent. Pain, odor, stainsel had to be managed without anyone noticing. So how were those gowns kept clean? Here's the shocking truth. They weren't. At least not like we think of laundry today. Washing a Victorian dress risked ruining it. Fabrics like silk and velvet couldn't survive soap and water, so full washes were rare, sometimes only twice a year, what households called the Great Wash. Instead, dresses were sprinkled with powders to mask odor, brushed clean, and stored in cedar-lined trunks to keep away moths. Undergarments, the layers beneath, absorbed the sweat and grime, and those could be boiled and scrubbed. The outer gown was preserved as long as possible. A beautiful gown could last years, even if it carried the smell of its owner. It's important to remember that not all Victorians lived alike. The wealthy hid their chamber pots in carved cabinets, while servants whisked them away. Poor families often had just one pot for everyone. In high society, women had maids too. Help them navigate skirts and chamber pots. In poorer homes, privacy didn't exist. At elegant events, gentlemen might stroll into the garden to relieve themselves among the roses. For working men in the city, the street was the bathroom. The Victorian era was full of contradictions. Outwardly, it was an age of refinement, strict etiquette, and beauty. But behind the scenes, life was dirty, smelly, and shockingly unhygienic. Beneath gowns of silk and lace, women managed menstruation. With rags and moss, ballrooms lit with chandeliers, chamber pots hid under chairs, streets overflowed with filth while doctors preached about morality, and yet society marched forward. Plumbing slowly improved. Toilets became more common. Hygiene evolved, though often much later than we'd like to imagine. So now ask yourself, if you had the chance, would you step back into this world? Would you wear the gowns, waltz through the ballrooms, and live under the rules of Victorian elegance, knowing the daily reality of sewage, chamber pots, corn cobs, and the dreaded Great Wash? The gowns were stunning, the manner strict, the parties dazzling. But beneath the layers of silk and steel, life was far less glamorous. Maybe, just maybe, we should be grateful for our modern bathrooms, our washing machines, and yes, even our toilet paper.